Welcome to Generation Influence, a new podcast about the movers and shakers behind the scenes of influencer marketing and e-commerce. I'm your host, Bill Hildebolt, one of the co-founders of gen.video, an influencer marketing and e-commerce platform that works with global companies around the world. Today, we are very privileged to have Vivek Rastogi from Colgate-Palmolive on the podcast. Vivek is the global head of digital and e-commerce. Vivek, that is a doozy of a title. Can we start by having you tell us what all that encompasses and a bit about your career path?
Sure, Bill. Hi everyone. Super excited to be here. Well, very simply put, I look at the end-to-end commercial strategy for digital commerce for Colgate, which essentially means looking at strategy, looking at how do we need to kind of look at our different processes, our different work streams to really accelerate our digital commerce growth. Two aspects of my business. One is, of course, as I said, crafting strategies, really working with the senior leadership to see where we need to push boundaries, but also at the same time working with with our in-market teams on the ground to really help them implement those strategies and help them navigate some of the challenges that we face as we try to kind of accelerate our growth. So that's what my role is. The second part of your question about my career path, yes, I've been with Colgate all the way through my career, so 16 and a half years now at Colgate. Been fortunate enough to do a lot of different sales and marketing roles within the organization and across very different geographies. So I've worked in India, the UK, and the US. In the US now for about 5 years, and currently in this role for about 6 months. But before that, I was leading our e-commerce business for the US company.
Wow. Well, I want to circle back at the end to talk about that career path. It feels to me kind of like a throwback, the corporate guy that like moves around the world with the company and steadily rises up through the ranks. And you don't hear that as much, I feel, anymore. And I definitely want to circle back to that. But we should definitely dig into your current role. That is a very wide span. And so I definitely want to ask, what are you most excited about? I mean, so you must have this plethora of choices of things to spend your time on. I mean, you obviously do. And there's no way you're going to be able to cover everything, every nuance within all those areas you can touch. So what are you most excited about and spending most of your time focused on? And maybe start, if you could, tell us a little bit, you mentioned innovating. And do you feel like it's more about innovation and pushing the boundaries, or is it about process improvement and grinding, the details on all those different areas to make them work together? What is most important? And again, are you most excited about at the moment?
I think both of them are equally important, right? There's obviously given how digital commerce has kind of disrupted our industries and especially our categories in the CPG industries, we are almost forced to do a lot of innovation, a lot of recreate a lot of our processes. I always say that as CPG companies, we have been selling to brick and mortar stores forever. Like Colgate itself has been selling, in physical stores for almost 200 years now. And we know exactly how that playbook works. But digital commerce disrupts that. And therefore you have to go back to your processes, see what works, what doesn't work anymore, and you've got to reimagine and readapt and, all of that stuff. And that excites me also, right? That for me is the most exciting thing in terms of this is a new industry. It generally takes companies like us out of our comfort zone. And now you certainly have to realize, okay, what do I do differently? How do I really adapt myself to this new reality? Which is incredibly exciting. And to be honest, it also keeps me up at night also, right? Because it's not easy, right? You're used to doing things a certain way and suddenly those things or some of those things don't work. But I think when I look back at our journey in the last 5-7 years that we have been on this digital transformation journey or e-commerce to digital commerce journey, we've become more nimble, we've become more agile, we have innovated a lot of stuff even in our processes, in our org structures, in the ways of working. And I think that just makes us a better company and a better business. And all of that is super exciting as well. What also is our focus is, and make no mistake about it, there's still a lot of challenges. There's still a lot of things that we need to fix and figure out. So the focus right now for my role is, how do you embed that mindset, that culture in your commercial functions or in your commercial processes and in your day-to-day operations, right? Are we talking the right language? Do we have the right mindset now, or we are kind of stuck in our past? And that's an interesting dynamics that I live every day. Super excited about that.
Yeah, that makes all the sense in the world. I mean, change is hard, and change management is one of the hardest pieces of business. And so, keeping the team excited and leaning into that, I can only imagine that is a never-ending journey. And sort of to that end, and sort of the fear of change or the pace of change. I want to circle back to something you said in our prep meeting. You said e-commerce is history. And the journalist in me just got so excited. I was like, there's my headline. E-commerce expert says e-commerce is history. And so I want to ask, what did you mean by that? I feel like it's probably something slightly different than the layperson would take away from that comment. So how should our thinking be evolving to encompass what underlines whatever you were thinking? So tell us what you meant. And what did you take away from it?
I'm glad you asked me that, because I must clarify what I meant, because coming from me would be a little weird. What I really meant is that I think the way things have evolved in the last I would say post-pandemic especially, is that it's not about e-commerce only anymore, right? I think this journey started, especially in the CPG companies, about 5 or 6 years back. And for the last 4 or 5 years back, you could just look at e-commerce and you just focus on it and just have your entire team structures built around e-commerce and all that stuff. And that was working fantastically well, right? But that was for the last 4 or 5 years. As we come, especially post-pandemic, and things have changed, consumers have changed, and the behaviors are changing. You cannot just look at e-commerce as a standalone sales channel. It worked for us for the last 4 or 5 years. I don't think so it's going to work for us going forward. And that's what I meant by saying e-commerce is history, because you just cannot talk about e-commerce. I think the consumers of today don't really recognize e-commerce or brick and mortar or physical stores and all that stuff, right? If I were to step outside of my Colgate hat, and I encourage a lot of people within our company to do so, right? Just think of a normal consumer, and obviously it's easier said than done because you're so embedded in the business. But I speak a lot to my family and friends, and I just try to understand what are they thinking. And you'll be surprised. A lot of times they don't even think about these things that you and I spend most of our time on, right? For them, it's not e-commerce or physical stores. It is just where they shop, and it's not offline or online anymore. It's offline and online. And I think that's an interesting dynamic, especially post-pandemic, because people who never went online are now buying online. People who thought they will never go back to the store during the pandemic are now going back to the store. And for me, that's an interesting dynamic and therefore we need to now adapt again. Where our strategy, our planning, our execution needs to be more holistic. You cannot just look at e-commerce. And that's what I meant by saying e-commerce is history. It is what we are calling omni-commerce now, or omni-channel now. And think about it, right? Especially with the mobile commerce coming in, social media and all that stuff. Gone are the days where you had a specific time of shopping, you had a specific place for shopping, right? Mm-hmm. Today's consumers can shop anywhere, anytime, whether you're on a train journey back to your office or you're sitting in bed just before going to bed and you're shopping. And therefore, for brands like us, the challenge is to be omnipresent. And what I call not only omnipresent, but omnipresentable, right? You got to have your brand come up in front of your audiences and your consumers in an equally good manner, no matter where it is, right? And therefore, you cannot just look at e-commerce anymore. You have to look at your brick and mortar as well, in line with that. Now, the other term which is going around in the industry these days is called, it's not physical or digital, it's phygital. So that's really what you're talking about. So that's the context behind my statement saying e-commerce is it. It's not. It's still a very important sales channel or a channel for growth, strategic channel for most companies. But you got to expand it and look at everything together now.
That's awesome. I think that is really, really interesting, helpful. And I want to throw a curveball question at you that's a little outside what we talked about in our pre-call, but you know, and pardon the brief and commercial interruption, but the success of gen.video has been predicated around that we help global brands like Colgate-Palmolive in their e-commerce multi-channel strategy, right? So we're built for people that are selling through Amazon, through Walmart, through Target, and as opposed to a DTC only strategy. And we can incorporate a DTC strategy in it, but again, we're built really for somebody who is selling through multiple channels online. And the only reason we don't as much include offline, although we're getting there, is because it's so hard to connect the offline to the digital. And so what occurs to me when you say, okay, yep, absolutely. Not only though do we have to be multi-channel online, including potentially thinking about our DTC strategy, but now we have to really incorporate back in that brick and mortar strategy. And so here's my question. I've got to assume that you feel like the data to be able to really understand how all the pieces fit together is lagging behind where you are on the execution. Because to me, the data is even lagging behind. And again, this is part of our success, is helping big brands understand how a digital activation works across their panoply of digital sellers. When you now try to incorporate the offline channel again, you obviously have different data sources, but marrying them all together has got to be a huge part of the challenge. And I would assume that a lot of times you feel like you're flying blind a little bit. Is that true? Is that not true? I mean, feel free to push back.
No, it is true. It is true. The data is lagging. The data or a solution does not exist. Now in my ideal world, right? I'm sitting on my desktop and I can just look at, say, this is what I'm doing online. This is what I'm doing offline. And, I can like create a complete picture with all the elements and inputs coming in to see exactly, what's linking to what is my shopper journey, who did what, and, all of that stuff. That doesn't exist today. You're right. There is no data. But having said that, this has been a problem forever. I think only in the last couple of years we are talking omni-channel, and possibly things were relatively easier at that time because the confluence was not as much between online and offline. And now suddenly you're talking about digitally influenced sales, right? So people starting to search on Amazon or Google and then going into the store to buy stuff, and how your PDP on Amazon might impact sales at Walmart, right? So all of that's there. But having said that, right, I think that's where the innovation and technology comes into the play, because now the consumer journeys are not linear anymore. They're all complex and overlapping and all of that stuff. And I think there's solutions coming out in the market, which are trying to solve for that. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think, and retail media, I'm sure you've heard the term, like retail media potentially, at least in theory, can solve for that problem, because suddenly you're talking to a retailer who has a data of offline and online, and they're trying to bridge it together. And now suddenly we are talking about retail media, not only about, what we're doing online. There is retail media happening in stores in terms of your digital screens and all of that stuff. So I think there are solutions, or the companies and startups and technology providers who are trying to solve for that problem. Are we there yet? Absolutely not. But I think there's tremendous progress happening, and there is tremendous developments happening and innovation happening in that front as well. So I'm hoping that maybe we'll get better in the next couple of years or so.
That's awesome. That is great to hear. Well, perfect segue. Let's talk about retail media. I think this is clearly one of the big mega trends in the collective space that we're talking about. It has really picked up steam after sort of the first few years of kind of fits and trials a little bit. But it's still pretty new. And so where would you recommend someone start on their journey to do more with retail media? What are the pros and cons. I mean, obviously the ability to target and to get more of that data input is a big pro. But what are you seeing? And again, big question is, where should someone start if they're not already spending in retail media?
Um, I can't recommend where one should start in terms of at least inviting this thing, but I think retail media is fascinating for me, for some of the reasons that I just mentioned. But I think for me, it's one of the biggest disruption that we have seen in the media space for some years now, if not forever, because it has a lot of potential, at least in theory. I talked about all of that coming together of online and offline and consumer data. Think about it, the potential of attribution, the potential of being able to advertise and market your products right at the point of sale, the amount of data and information and insights that you can collect all within one platform of a retailer is immense for me. And, really think about it, at least on paper, these are some of the challenges that marketers have always struggled to find solutions for, because, as the famous going says, right? Like half my advertising dollars are wasted. I don't know which half, right? And at least in theory, this helps you solve for that. So I think it's a dream for a lot of marketers to that extent. But it comes with a lot of challenges as well. And for me, having worked with sales and marketing teams, for me, the biggest interesting question that we have right now is if e-commerce blurred the lines between sales and marketing in the traditional sense, I think retail media has completely eliminated that boundary. The reason I say that is because I look at my teams and here is a salesperson or an account manager or somebody who's running a retail business. It's for the first time sitting in front of his customers and retailers and talking media strategy. That account manager has never done that. He's never planned for media now, but the retailers are now asking, okay, I want to have a retail media discussion as part of the JBP. And the salesperson and the account manager has never done that. So that's an interesting equation. The media planners or the advertisers, on the other hand, the people who traditionally be in the marketing side of things, have never sat in front of a retailer and talked about JBPs in that light. And therefore, this all comes together, right? And every retailer is pushing us for that. They're coming and telling us, going back to the previous discussion, we don't want your online strategy. We need your omni-channel strategy, or we want you to invest X amount of money as part of the JPP plans now, which has traditionally been a more sales plan, so to say. So I think that's an interesting dynamic that we're just grappling with, right? It questions a lot of your team structures. It questions a lot of your capability building, that now you have to suddenly look at new talent profiles and new capability buildings for that team. So that's challenging in itself. But at the end of the day, I think that's definitely a very interesting dynamics. The other example that I always say is, when you're talking about a CPG company or a retailer, right? Who's the client now and who's the customer now, right? Because you're spending media dollars, but they buy products from you and all that stuff. So for me, all of that is fascinating. But going back to the potential, I think there's so much innovation happening in this space. Like, this is a relatively new field, but there's more and more players coming in. The platforms are evolving, they're changing, they're improving. Just the fact that the margin potential for the retailers and retail media is so huge that this is only going to get bigger and bigger, and we're going to get more and more pushed. So, but I think with all of that innovation that's going to happen in this space, we will be able to solve a lot of that data problem and that blind spot that we've always operated in. And I think that's incredibly exciting for me. How we can, I think the bigger question in the next 6 months, 8 months, or even now is, how can you really leverage that potential, right? So we get all of this data, but how do we now use it, right? And how do we now use it effectively will always be a question. But I think we'll see a lot more innovation, a lot more technology solutions coming when it comes to attribution and how you can target and, do your niche audience segments and so on and so forth. So for me, one of the most exciting spaces to be in right now.
That is amazing. That is so many things popped off in my head as you were kind of going through that, and maybe none more profound for me anyway, in that, as you were talking about, like, the teams and the organization and the connectivity that didn't exist before. I mean, the the reality, a lot of the brand managers we work with, even today, they're a little bit divorced from understanding like the dynamics of working directly with an Amazon. That's not their job. It's the salesperson's job. And so, and so even for us, there can be this sort of education point. Now there are brand managers that are deeply embedded and understand all the dynamics and nuances of e-commerce. But, that's still today, I feel like more the exception than the rule. But the fact is that retail media could be a conduit to bringing people deeper into that environment is very interesting, and will only, make that the brand manager position more exciting, more interesting as they build up those skill sets. That's really interesting.
And I think, to be honest, I think we'll be forced into it, right? Like whether we like it or not like it. I think gone are the days where you can have a sales team and you can have a marketing team and all that stuff. Of course, there'll always be room for specialists and specializations. But I think, as I said, it completely eliminates that boundary as far as I'm concerned. So that's interesting.
It is very interesting. Let's talk about Amazon for a second. So if we really talk about the beginning of retail media, probably, and again, thinking about e-commerce tacking on a media offering, it probably actually started with Walmart, who was initially outsourcing that to a company called Triad Media. So they were doing it through a third party. And I think that Walmart wasn't as big as Amazon. It was pretty nascent at Walmart online. I'm speaking of specifically. And so the industry really changed when Amazon stepped into the game. And so we can give them kind of really credit for lighting the fuse, if not being the first. And they're huge now. And so are they still way ahead? Are people catching up? Like what's interesting in retail media as you look at it where we are today?
Yeah. I think Amazon still is a major and possibly the biggest player even now. And so for me, call it retail media, call it whatever definition you want to give it. At the end of the day, it's still media, right? And media has always been about eyeballs and traffic. And to that extent, obviously, Amazon has a head start, right? And I think that that's going to continue just because this, widely shared stat saying 67% of the searches of products happen on Amazon now and not on Google, right? So, so I think they definitely have a head start. But having said that, as we were just talking about it, like there's just so much happening. There's so many players coming into the fore. They're trying to, get into new innovation and new solutions and new technology. And I think you will see a lot more disruption happening in this space. Just the other day, if you happen to hear the Walmart earning call for the last quarter, I think their CFO made the statement saying that they'll make more money on digital advertising than they actually make throughout their entire offline stores. Now, a Walmart saying that is huge, right? Especially in the US, right? So that's the potential. And that's where I think this is just going to get bigger. Others are catching up and catching up fast. But I think it will eventually boil down to, of course, the traffic, but what kind of solution that you are able to bring to brands like us, and how do you solve for some of those challenges about attributions and how effectively a brand can use that data and what you can offer to them on the table would be a very, very interesting space, I would say, in the next 2 to 3 years, maybe even 18 to 24 months, maybe, as things are so fast paced here. But this would be interesting space to watch out. So yes, others are definitely catching up, and I believe you'll see a lot more innovative solutions coming in this space.
Yeah, that is an amazing thing to think about. Like, because if you think about the idea that Walmart sees its potential, right? An implication of that earnings call is that Walmart steps back and says, okay, we're really in the game of having conversations with consumers. And the providing of a product at the end of that is a sort of a necessary outcome to the conversation that we want to have. If you believe that, you start to look at DTC competition, other retail competition in a very different light. And you would actually change the way you'd think about merchandising. You'd make all kinds of different decisions. Because I know, obviously, one of the challenges, if you're a brand, and certainly if we wind the clock back to when Walmart was the Amazon of its day, pre-e-commerce, right? Basically, the struggle was that Walmart would tell you what to deliver, what price to deliver it at, would make product selections. I mean, again, I was in finance 30 years ago, and that was the challenge, is that Walmart was setting the price, telling you what your mix was going to be, telling you everything, and it was their world and you were living in it. We sort of went through a period where that was true of Amazon. But again, if this becomes about media and conversations, they start to move out of the merchandising mindset, or at least they have a different perspective on it. So that's a sea change. That's a mega trend we should all keep our eye on. And for a little bit more history there, maybe the next chapter after kind of my Walmart offline, the infamous trip to Bentonville, and let's take it to the Amazon period. So your entry point to America was straight into Seattle in 2018, which was a moment when Amazon was absolutely on top of the world. And, we could argue they still are, but this was a unique moment in their share and their power, in the way the world was going. And what many people don't know, though, is that period was defined by the word crap, especially as regards to the relationship between Amazon and CPG companies like Colgate-Palmolive. So some of our listeners don't even know what I'm talking about. And so first, if you can explain to them what that means and tell us about your immersion into American culture and American e-commerce. So you sort of, I just get this image, and I guess the sadist in me almost like starts to giggle when I think of this guy coming across the ocean, landing, in Seattle with this job to like work with Amazon. And then he gets thrown right into the middle of something, defined as crap. You had to think like, what has happened? Where am I? And so tell us about it.
That's exactly what happened. To be honest, like I moved to the US in 2018, coming into the business, which was growing fast and furious for us in the last, in the previous few years. And the idea was to kind of continue that momentum. And I think I landed on the day that the first purchase order hit the CPG industries which was like 30% or 20% of what you're regular. I think I remember I don't even know anything about the business, and I just landed, and people are just talking about the purchase orders are low today from Amazon. We didn't even know what happened. So yes, that was the time that the crap wave hit us, as I call it. And for those of you who don't know crap, it stands for cannot realize a profit, which is a term that Amazon used at the time, which says that if a particular SKU or an item in their portfolio does not make a profit, they will delist it. And they delisted plenty at that time, especially for the CPG companies, because we were still selling fairly low ASP items and so on and so forth. So that was a fun time. Absolutely, it was interesting because, to be honest, the entire industry, and I spoke to so many people here, and Seattle, you get to know so many people who just work with Amazon, in different capacities. The industry didn't know what hit them, really, because the hands of the wheel approach for Amazon, was also the fact that there was no heads up, there was no discussion. Just one fine day, just stop receiving purchase orders, and then you figure out what just happened. And the reason it was surprising to a lot of the entire industry was because before that period, the entire focus was on top line, right? So Amazon was growing triple digits possibly at that time, and then the companies were growing with them, and nobody cared in terms of what happened with the rest of the P&L, right? Everybody was happy growing the top line, and suddenly when they pivoted, that shocked the industry quite a bit. So that was absolutely a fun time. But hindsight is obviously a very good thing, Bill. But a lot of people ask me saying, "Oh, that was such a bad period," and trust me, seemed like a really bad time to be in that business at that time. But now when I look back, I possibly now think that was the best thing to happen to the industry at that time. And the reason I say that is because, one, the business for a lot of CPG companies was still small when it comes to e-commerce business. And it was obviously Amazon drove that thing. But actually, it opened eyes for a lot of CPG companies for overall e-commerce business, where suddenly there was a realization that you cannot just lift and shift your brick and mortar or a physical store playbook, and apply it to e-commerce. This is a different business. This is a different business model, and therefore need to go back to the first question that we were talking about. You have to go back to your process and reimagine things. You have to come up with your own e-commerce strategy, because maybe to a large extent, we did not even have an e-commerce strategy. We were just happy selling our product the way we had always sold anywhere else. And I think that forced us to look into all of those things. And I think the industry moved. Therefore, we adapted, we reimagined, we created new processes, led to a lot of innovation as well. Like, for example, if you look at the kind of portfolio that even CPG companies sell on e-commerce today, I'm not even talking Amazon. I think it just paved the way for entire e-commerce. You see there are different kind of forms. There's the product configuration is different. The pricing is different. The different forms are different. There are new innovation in terms of forms just to reduce the weight and all of that stuff. And I think I give that crap out wave a lot of credit to where we are as an industry and how much we can leverage that channel today. So as I said, hindsight is a very good thing, but I think it was interesting. And possibly a good thing for the industry to happen, because we were kind of, again, forced out of our comfort zone. And a lot of people ask me, what is so different about e-commerce, the business model and all that stuff. And I give them one example, right? What is inherent to e-commerce is the shipping and the delivery. Now, when you sell it to a physical store, that line item does not exist in your P&L. And in a country like US, shipping and delivering, especially when you're trying to deliver in 24 hours and 48 hours, is expensive. But consumers don't want to pay for delivery fee. That's there. Somebody needs to pay for it. And therefore, we had to go back to look at our P&L, saying, how do I now account for this new expensive line item that has come into the foray, which was never the talking point earlier? So e-commerce is an expensive business model, especially for CPG companies. And we were forced to figure out our ways. And I think the company and the industry did some really good stuff to kind of be creative. Obviously, we worked with Amazon. We worked with a lot of other e-commerce players to kind of help us, get that model right. But I think eventually the industry did. So all good now.
Yeah, no, that is a great answer. I mean, and I love how it tied back to the original answer, the original question, and the idea that, you've got to think about what is the context that I'm in today, and adapt your processes to that situation. Because if you don't, and this is the answer, if you don't, you are going to get and end up with a problem. And that is, in this case, it's the shifting from focus on top line to focus on profitability. And so, you want to be nimble and you want to stay ahead of that. And, one thing you could think about, like coming out of the crap here is, right, did it cause, loss of trust, for example, in the relationship with Amazon? And the answer is no, it shouldn't. Like, everybody was playing the same game. And, the fact that they created a forcing action to get the industry to evolve, again, not necessarily like to say, oh, everyone should have anticipated it, but there's probably something like, to recognize the dynamics of the situation that you were in, be conscious of that, and, be ready to evolve. So I love that. That is amazing. All right, well, let's shift gears a little. We've got just a few minutes left. And there are a couple things I want to get around to. In fact, one of them is, we've talked a lot about e-commerce, but we're also supposed to talk about influencer marketing, and I'll get in trouble with the powers that be behind this podcast if I don't talk about it. So, and you haven't said anything about how great influencers are. And so we have to pay our due to the people who now run the world. So for Colgate-Palmolive, what are you finding is the biggest value? Is it reaching new audiences? Is it listening to them to understand where the market's going? Are you able to successfully repurpose any of the content they create for you? And if there are any challenges you want to highlight for the audience as well, I'm happy to hear those. So tell us a little bit about how you guys think about the space, which is now itself become pretty mature.
It is. And I think we think about, and we do all of that, what you mentioned, right? I think Influencers are increasingly becoming an important part of our marketing mix in that sense, because just the influence that influencers have on today's audiences, which is Gen Z and millennials, and all of the new audiences, which are becoming a core segment for a lot of our brands now. And we got to recognize that these people get influence and they shop very differently. I spoke about the influence of social media and how everything happens on a device right now could happen anywhere, and you realize that a lot of that is happening because of the influence of social media. In fact, we have seen a couple of examples, actually not even planned. I would love to take credit for it, but we have realized that there would have been some Instagram, influencer of sorts, completely organic, would have used, uh, just put, I remember this happened about a year and a half back. That influencer put like a 10 or a 12-second video of using one of our whitening pens. And I was running the Amazon business in the US at that time. And we woke up in the morning and like, what just happened? Why is our sales 10x overnight? And because it was completely organic, we had no idea that happened. And we had to then go and figure out like what happened, And I'm asking all the questions to my marketing team. Did you guys do anything and all that stuff? So it's just an example of saying you never know what happened. And that's the kind of influence and power these influencers can have. So it's an interesting space. What I'd say, however, I think, and you're a much better and a bigger expert than I am in this space, but I think the way companies like ours had used or looked at influencers has changed, right? Earlier, I believe it was all about numbers and how many followers a certain influencer or a celebrity has. And I think now it's more about finding your niche influencer, like, the influencer who might not have like 5 digits or 6 digits or 7 digit number of followers, but they have a big credibility and influence within that niche segment. Whitening, for example, is one space where we use a lot of influencers and all that stuff. And I think that has shifted where I think these niche influencers possibly perform or work even better than those mass followers that we used to have. So I think that approach changed, and I think it's only going to get better. And again, going back to all the data and the attributions we were talking about, I think it's going to be more and more there. So I think the only thing that I think there's still a little bit of a question mark is to the point that he was saying there is a brand speak language and there is a user generated content language, right? And how do you marry the two is a challenge still, I would say. In terms of, do you completely let it flow? Do you completely curate it, or is there a fine balance or a sweet point in between? That's an ongoing conversation. But I think other than that, their influence is only gonna this space is only gonna get bigger.
Yes, it's definitely become a mega trend in the marketing space. And so the challenge of, what we're certainly finding is the more you can contextual, it's all contextual. It comes back to your exact point, like understanding the environment you're in. So the more you can let it flow when it's on the influencers channel and in their sort of organic sphere, the better. When it is on a product page, even though it might still be being delivered by an influencer, the having a little bit more of the curation seems to be the right balance. And so again, I think it's your insight that you got to think about the context that you're in. But that's great. And so let's shift one step over, or maybe we're coming kind of back to the middle. So something that's very much between e-commerce and influencer is live shopping. So you're from Greater Asia, and I'm hoping you can answer what to me is one of the great mysteries currently in the influencer space, which is, why has live shopping not taken off in America the way it is in Asia? For me personally, it's been kind of a disaster. Maybe you will have a different view, but it's been one of those things we've been talking about it probably for 5+ years, and it's always right around the corner. And I personally haven't seen it take off. Is that ever going to change here? Or is there something fundamentally different culturally between the US and Asia?
Oh, I've never thought of it that way, but now when I think of it, For me, disaster might be a little bit of a harsh word. It might not be a disaster. And the reason I say that is because did US invent connected TV or live night TV, whatever is the right word for it, shopping TV. So that concept, I think, has always existed in the US. So I think people are familiar with it. But I think what you mean is, a lot of these streaming apps now where there's live, influencers and, the live shopping experience, the likes of Amazon Live, and there's lots of them out there right now. I think the reason it has not really blown away, as you rightly said, a lot of us expected it, and I see that because of two reasons. One, I genuinely think, again, going back to talking to a regular consumer and not people like you and I don't think so. The awareness of these streaming platforms is that much high right now, and I think the companies need to do a lot better job in just driving awareness on for Amazon Live or for XYZ thing out there. I don't think so. We have participated in a lot of campaigns on these platforms, and one of our learnings has always been saying there's just not enough awareness, and we could have done a better job of driving that awareness and traffic and all that stuff. So I think that's one. And I think the second thing is going back to the previous point that I was making is when I look at this live streaming and influencers, on that, the content, and this is just my personal view, I think the content still comes across too curated to me. And that's a bummer, right? Because you're talking about an influencer who's supposed to be an expert in that field, but it seems a lot of brands speak. That's again just caveat here. That's my personal view, but I see like, okay, and then you lose the trust and the credibility, and which is I think the very foundation where this entire influencer marketing kind of is built on. So for me, those are the two areas that we possibly have to grapple with, in the US at least. I think the other part of your question about Asia versus the US and all that stuff, I don't know so much about Asia, but when you talk about like Asian context, a lot of times celebrities, and I think that the difference between the influence and the following of celebrities in the US and the Asia it boils down to the cultural thing there, right? I come from India, which is a huge celebrity kind of a culture. China is similar, and possibly most of Asia. And I think it's just that, like the impact, the influence, and the following that celebrities, and I'm talking about like the big celebrities, I'm talking about movie stars and singers and so on and so forth. The kind of following that they enjoy there possibly is not as much. I'm not saying obviously it's Hollywood land. So there's a lot of following there, but the kind of influence that they can exert on a regular consumer, I think is very different. And I joke around with people when I say that, like, if you want to spot that cultural difference, look at the way a crowd reacts when you spot a big celebrity at an airport in China versus the US, right? Or in India versus the US, right? It's a completely different reaction of people when they spot a celebrity. And I think that translates into how they can influence like brands and marketing with brands and endorse brands in that sense. So that for me is a little bit of a cultural difference more than anything else.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think well, I don't know how solvable any of those issues are really. The cultural difference though maybe explains the difference in success. You actually touched on something I really hadn't fully grokked in my own mind though, which I do think there's something very different about an influencer on their channel recommending a product, typically in context in their home, showing it, with their husband or their kids or, whatever. And them doing that. And, their sponsored content is one out of every 3 or 4 or 5 posts.
Yeah.
That's very different from them adopting the sort of the QVC rapid selling, right? It does change the perception of authenticity when there's, again, somewhere between an auctioneer and a QVC seller. That's a different dynamic. I need to go spend some more time thinking about that. It was really insightful. Thank you. All right. Well, we're almost out of time. And so I want to wrap up, coming back as I promised I would, to the fact that you've been at Colgate-Palmolive, as you said, 16 plus years, been your entire career. You've moved around the world with them. There is something special clearly about Colgate-Palmolive that exist, because that you would choose to do that, knowing that's probably been a ton of different opportunities for you to do different things. And so tell us what has kept you there and what's going to keep you there for the next 16 years. What are you excited about looking forward? You're probably like, I'm going to be retired in the next 16 years.
When I hear that, it seems obviously long, and you make me feel old, Bill. But it doesn't really feel that way. A lot of people ask me this question, and I think I think kudos to Colgate, right? They've kept it fresh for me, right? I've moved around, I've got into new businesses, and every time you come to a US where nobody knows you, even though it's the same company, you start afresh, and it's a new challenge and all that stuff. So to that extent, I give credit to Colgate to kind of giving me that exposure, opportunities across different functions, roles, geographies, and they've kept it fresh for me, right? So it doesn't seem like 16, 17 years. But I think, and that's an interesting fact about Colgate. A lot of people who join Colgate, always, this is the consistent feedback we hear saying, oh, everybody's 15 years, 20 years, 25 years in this company and all that stuff. So that kind of goes to say that I'm one of those many people at Colgate who've spent some time there. And I think it boils down to one, I think Colgate is genuinely a career-oriented company, right? They genuinely believe in giving a lot of exposures, a lot of cross-functional exposure, geography exposure. Being as a global company helps, obviously, but they proactively manage the talent that way. And there's enough and more focus on, capability building for internal talent. So that's one thing which I give a lot of credit to Colgate for. And why have I stayed there? I think about it, and it's difficult for me to kind of point in one thing, but for me, and it might sound cliche, but I think it just boils down to the people. I just like the way, or I've always liked the kind of people that I've got to work with. They're nice people, right? And make no mistake, right? We're still operating in a very competitive world. So there are their targets and their goals and their objectives, and we have our own disagreements and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, you like your colleagues, and you like the way that the company culture is, and you like the way you work with people. And that's important to me, because if you're going to spend more than half of your day talking to your colleagues and all that stuff, you need to enjoy that process. And I think that's what's kept me at Colgate.
That is awesome. What a great note to end on. And even more inspiring to hear that there's a lot of colleagues there. It's just such a great message at this time where, especially across the tech world, we're seeing so many layoffs take place. And so that's the kind of story we all want to hear. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, everyone who's been listening, for tuning in. This was an incredible interview, and I want to thank you, Vivek, for giving us such useful, actionable insights into the world of e-commerce and influencer marketing.
Thank you, Bill. A pleasure having you here, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you thought about the influencer and the celebrities culture. I'd love to exchange notes there. But thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Yes, we will definitely be staying in touch. All right. Thanks, everyone. Hey, thanks for tuning in. New episodes of Generation Influence drop every Wednesday, so be sure to subscribe to listen on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Next week's guest is Laura Gustafson from Elanco, a leading animal health company. You don't want to miss Laura. She's a CPG e-commerce pioneer. Hope to see you there.